Hey, well, this is Philip Ingram, and you're watching the Break It Down show. Hey, Pete.
I love it. I had I don't know if you know Mark Polyamorous. He's Greek. He's a CIA guy. I don't know if you ever met him before and you guys have worked it all before, but man, what a great guy. And I love our little community of intel people. For those who don't know, Philip and I worked in the intelligence world. We have a lot of experience doing really crazy things. But when you ask us questions, and people love to dismiss, what do you know? There's a guy right now in my YouTube comments telling me, you don't know anything about anything. I'm like, okay, well, that's funny. But when we get a chance to talk, we can talk very clearly. We're not worried about politics, but we can bring in the political element into these things.
Yeah.
And have these conversations because there is nuance in them. And we were just talking about the flags behind you and the nuance within that. And, look, you're clearly Irish, but people will tell you, oh, you're not Irish. I've got an A's fan on.
I'm not allowed to be a proper Irishman, but yeah.
I was going to say I have an A's fan hat on. I'm an A's fan, grew up an A's fan, but there are A's fans that will tell me, you're not an A's fan. Like, it's not your call, like if you are Irish, you're Irish, right? And so how Irish do you have to be?
Well, exactly. I was born in the island of Ireland. I was born in Northern Ireland, which is part of the United Kingdom. I joined the British Army and became an intelligence officer in the British Army. So hence why you see my Union flag behind me. But I am a dual passport holder. So I've got my Irish flag that's there because, I feel as much Irish as I feel British, but I'm British Irish. And this is where the island is fantastic because it allows you to do that. It's a single culture. There's so much garbage talked about it. People talk about the conflict in Ireland as being the English versus the Irish and the Protestants versus the Catholics. Well, if we go back in history, and this is something that I hope our listeners will love, you've got the orange parades on the 12th of July, and everyone thinks that's the big Protestant versus Catholic parades that go on. If you go back into the history, it's celebrating a battle called the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. And the Battle of the Boyne in 1690 was between two sides. The Irish Catholics, who were led by an English king, against a Dutch interloper who'd stolen the English crown, King William of Orange, with a German mercenary army backed up with a few Scots and a few others in it. And interestingly, he was a Protestant because he was Dutch, but he was backed by the Pope, because the Pope didn't want the rise of Ireland in Catholicism to potentially rival what was going on in Rome and the Vatican. And therefore, he backed this Protestant Dutch interloper against the Irish army led by an English king. So how do you put that into the current context with the politics that are going on? Because the English the English monarchy was fighting on behalf of the Irish. And this is what confuses people totally. And history is spun around with so much disinformation to try and get us to the different little boxes we love to put everything in today.
Yeah. Well, that goes to this whole Israeli Palestine conflict. First off, we don't call it the Israel versus Palestine war.
Palestine never existed as a country. It's a region.
Right.
And the regional references, you go right back in history. And actually the Jews existed and the Jewish nation existed in what everyone likes to refer to as Palestine long before the Muslim faith was actually born. And the current Arab Muslims that are referred to as Palestinians existed. So again, we allow history to confuse things.
Sure. And to be fair to all of the Arabs, they've got a 3,000-year history. It was south of there when it started, right?
Yep.
And so we can track these things, and they are old. And as soon as you think you've got the earliest moment, you can find the next atrocity or whatever it's going to be.
Yeah.
It doesn't fit into a box neatly.
Yeah.
And yet, even if it did, it wouldn't matter, because how are you going to sort these two apart? They're just like two kids that won't stop fighting.
Well, it's a very interesting point. I simplify it. I'm an Irishman. I have to simplify things. I'm a British Irishman. I have to simplify things even further. And it's, when you look at it from a historical perspective, what we've got happening in the Middle East is a Sunni Shia civil war being fought out by the two major nations that represent each of those factions, Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're fighting it out by proxy in countries that have been artificially created, such as Yemen, such as the other Arab nations that are there. And most of these countries have been artificially created in, and here's where our US listeners are going to get away with it. It's not an American fault. It's actually a British fault, a German fault, a French fault, a European fault, because America was still trying to work out where it was going and where it fitted into the world. But at the time, whenever in London, our bowler-hatted civil servants sat down with a map of Persia and went, we're going to create this country that we'll call Persia, but eventually will become Iran, and drew a straight line on a map, ignoring all of the tribal boundaries and the other ethnic pieces that came in and the differences between different elements of the religious divide. And that happened all across the Middle East, and that's why the Middle East is a complete cluster as we see at the moment, because we created countries that didn't exist.
Yeah, I love it, and I want to spend some time here because first off, whenever I say the word Persia, if I'm not thinking about it, I'll say it with, I don't know if this would be plummy, but what I consider a plummy accent, I would say Persia.
Persia.
Persia. I can't say it normal.
It's got a really romantic sound to it, and actually, when you look at the history and you look at what happened before the current lot took over, when the Shah was in and they still had a royalty and everything else, it was almost this Middle Eastern romantic state. It was the Paris of the Middle East in many ways, and very forward in the rights that allowed its people and its women and all the rest of it. But then the religious fanatics took over, and we are where we are today.
And then I'm gonna bring our profession into this. We always we romanticize T.E. Lawrence and his incredible work out in the desert. However, one thing I learned from that, being a collector who goes out into the field, if you are not tethered in any way to the Army command, military command, when you show up, they aren't going to know what to do with you. And so he stayed out away too long, and it cost him the influence needed to go out and maybe draw those lines better. By the way, we still have people with bowlers trying to decide how to divide up Afghanistan or whatever it is. There's still people thinking they can outthink the system.
Yeah, well, exactly. And this is where one of the biggest problems that we have is we try to apply our Western and our own ways of thinking to different countries and think that the solution is the way we do it has to be the best solution for that country, when in reality, if you go back and analyze it and start to think of it from what is that country's perspective, you suddenly realize that actually this isn't a country. This is a geographical piece of land that has got different tribes on it, and we've got intertribal relationships that we're trying to force a further identity on. That doesn't quite work, and we're not doing that. And this is where, as intelligence professionals, we were always taught two things: one, to act as the conscience of the decision maker, and not be afraid to call them out and say, I disagree, sir or ma'am. But more importantly, to think of things from the opposition's perspective, and to look at things from there. Because if you start to look at things from their perspective, it gives you a completely different view, and you can put into context the decision making that your commanders are doing and advise them and say, hey boss, I don't necessarily think that that's the right way because this is the reaction it's going to cause. And I've done that, and I've had senior generals throw, and I'm going to date this a little bit, throw their filofaxes at me and say, Ingram, I will have no more of these defeatist intelligence briefings from you. I know better than you. And I go, okay, General, I'm just telling you my view.
Yeah, man, you could say that 100 times. And I don't know that like everybody's understanding the words that you're saying, but you and I understand just how powerful it is, because we bring part of our job is to bring bad news. Because again, you have to be at the commander, lose less. Like, hey man, you're getting your ass kicked.
I'd say it's reality rather than bad news. And it's putting into context. The bad news to the commander is actually what you're saying might not fit what they want to hear. And therefore that's what they say is bad news. But the reality is you have to bring an objective assessment into what you're doing, and you can't allow that to be influenced in any way, shape, or form. As soon as you allow it to be influenced, then you've lost it. You've lost your objectivity, and you become part of the groupthink. And we've seen so many problems with groupthink. And the reason why Iraq has turned out to be a debacle, and the reason why Afghanistan has turned out to be a debacle, is I think we had so many senior military commanders and political leaders turned around and went, it's easier to get into the groupthink and say, hey, we're doing so well in all of this, instead of going, no, the reality is we're doing well, but it's only because of the following things. And if we withdraw, that takes all those following things out, and it's going to fall to a bag of rat shit.
Yeah, the bad news thing. It's I guess it also is how your bad news is received. So we've got to out communicate. People have to have a relationship with the commander, at least in my sense of things, because if they understand what you're trying to do, they can twist the knobs in their unit. But when you start twisting knobs and telling staff, twist the knob, then they see Pete show up. They're like, oh, damn it. Like, because they're not allowed to get things right, but they're in this room whether you can't get things right. You've got to have Philip and Pete out in the field saying, here's what I'm seeing. And you are welcome to, like, I'm going to tell you what I see. You're welcome to question my analysis, but you can't question my observations. And they always, the staff jumps to question my observation. Like, I was standing there, I had this conversation. Well, you did it wrong. And I'm like, no, I didn't do it wrong. I watched this thing happen. I had this conversation, right? So, it's tough to get people on your own team to believe that you're on their team and helping them.
It is, and you brought up a very important point there. The critical relationship is with the intelligence lead and the commander, the boss, the decision maker, the person that's there, and you getting into that commander and earning their trust is the most important thing from a relationship perspective. And that often means that you then have to bypass all of the, because commanders are gatekeepers, and those gatekeepers tend to be precious about their access and who gets access. And trying to get around them half the time is most of your challenge. And therefore, the biggest problem with giving a commander a realistic understanding of what's going on is getting around all those people that should be seeing you as an asset, but they see you as a threat, because you're getting direct access to someone that they want to control. You're giving them a message, but they want to control the messages that are going in. And this is something that we've seen in operational theaters, where you get the no bad news to the boss. No, you're going to get a reality check to the boss, so the boss can properly have the information that he or she needs to make a proper decision.
And check our work, right? Here's what I'm seeing. You guys are saying why. I'm saying 15. If you think 15 isn't wrong, develop new questions, send other assets out and check and see. Because, it's getting things to groupthink out. It is very expensive. We're going to bring this back into Israel here in a second. So allow me to kind of change our gears. So we talk about this intelligence failure. What we're talking about is what that looks like, because for one, the enemy does not want you to know. They have the ability to hold that secret for as long as they can, and they may be successful with that. That is one absolute outcome where it's not an intelligence failure in that we didn't see it coming. It's just like it was undiscoverable, and they did a good job covering their tracks too. It is discoverable, but it's Ted down over there, 7 slots over and 15 slots down in the organization. He's like, hey, they're coming. There's 15 guys like Ted always saying, hey, they're coming. Like, shut up, Ted. Or they just ignore Ted because Ted, again, is too distant from the command. So there's a couple of things where the intelligence failure thing, it's not that somebody bumbles things. It's that there's a lot of these communication lines internally and externally that have to line up to allow, usually the thing self-defeats because it's very hard to pull that operation off. But sometimes it gets through and you're like, well, I don't know what we would have done different. Listen to every threat that comes through. Can't do that.
Well, 7th of October, I think, highlighted a complete intelligence failure. Now, it's easy with 2020 hindsight to criticize an activity that you're expecting 2020 foresight from. If intelligence officers were that good, none of us would be intelligence officers because we'd be winning the lottery every week. And wouldn't have to go and get ourselves involved in government jobs or anything else. So it's a really difficult job. And therefore, whenever we put the criticism in from 2020 hindsight perspective, you know what the start point is. The start point is something has happened, and you can build the picture. When you're doing it from the beginning, you're building a picture, one pixel at a time. Or in fact, if a pixel is made up of 3 colors on your 24K screen, you're building it up each color pixel at a time without an understanding of what the overall picture in the box is going to be as you put the jigsaw puzzle together. But 7th of October was an intelligence failure for 2 reasons, I think.
Okay, that's right.
One, the Israeli priority was on their southern border with Hezbollah. The Israeli northern border, the southern Lebanese border with Hezbollah, they shifted there. They had thought that their easing of what was going on from Gaza and allowing more Palestinians out of Gaza into Israel to work and all the rest of it was reducing the threat that was in there. That is what was being fed to them by their intelligence sources inside Gaza and everything else. So they're being fed what they wanted to hear. But this is the second reason. Hamas had done their homework and they knew what the Israelis wanted to hear. And therefore they continued to feed, and they'd identified the intelligence sources and how Israel was gathering that. And they knew Israel had focused its attention to its northern border and was focused on Hezbollah. And therefore what Hamas did as they were carrying out all their preparations was feed Israel with all of the information that they knew Israel wanted to reinforce the intelligence bias that was there, to reinforce the need to shift the priority to the Lebanese border. And then they continued their training, their preparation, and then went through the border. And Israel, whenever they got the indicators and warnings to say, and they got several of them to say, just be aware, Hamas is going to do something really nasty and going to do it soon. The Israelis went, no. Everything that we're being fed is saying they're not going to. And nobody turned around and went, actually, we need to take these anomalies that are coming in and analyze them properly. People dismissed them because it didn't fit the groupthink, and their intelligence services got into a groupthink that said that no, Gaza is going to be fine, and that's what enabled the Hamas activity on the 7th of October and the horrific attack that they put in.
Yeah, and going back to your example of working on a puzzle, then working on the pixels, you're starting with a premise and you go forward with that premise. And a lot of premises work for a long time and you don't realize they're wrong until your puzzle is so precious. You're like, no, there's some other mistake in here.
But then you put so much effort into convincing your boss that the picture that you're developing is right and all this. So it takes a very brave person to turn around and say, excuse me, boss, I've been telling you for the last 3 months that this is what the picture is. Well, I'm wrong. I have been wrong. I have let you down. The picture is actually this.
The amount of selling that goes on in the intelligence community, because we're all kind of taking our best guess, right? And there are people that are like, I got to go back and triangulate. Well, you're obsolete because you can't make a call. But the person who does sell best, man, they can look up to and including getting people killed from a targeting package. If they sell great, there's going to take their
I've got a very good example of this, and I have to be careful because of the individuals that were involved and different countries that were involved. But a country I was involved in where there was a multinational operation going in, and we had targeting information, and I got a very good relationship up into the KOC that was running the air campaign into this place, and the KOC was run by the United States. However, there was another intelligence operative working around in a different part of the operational theater, and that intelligence operative had a personal relationship with the senior commander, and that intelligence operative would speak to the senior commander every couple of days and update the senior commander. But because of that personal relationship, the senior commander would take the intelligence or the information that he got from this individual as gospel. Whereas intelligence that was coming from other sources that contradicted it and went up for the senior commander's decision making, he said, no, I've got a source that says that that's wrong. What the senior commander hadn't computed was that his source only contacted him every 2 or 3 days. That meant his information was probably 2 or 3 days out of date, and the situation on the ground was actually quite dynamic, and it resulted in a number of targets being hit where enemy forces had moved out of those target locations, friendly forces had moved into those target locations, or what we were referring to almost as friendly forces at that time, and it caused a significant number of casualties. What that resulted in was a real debate going on about intelligence sharing and dual reporting up different chains by the organization that had lost a significant number of its personnel in the attacks that were put in. And the attacks were, put in by, or the priority was given by this senior officer. And that resulted in an intelligence operation being closed down for one particular nation, whilst other nations had the chance to continue their intelligence operations, and it ended up in some very interesting negotiations going on between high-level agencies to try and reopen the taps again to get it going. But at the bottom line, what it did was it then allowed a better cooperation to come in as the operation developed, and that relationship then built up and added a much better picture later on. But it was costly, very costly.
Yeah. That's about to say, how expensive was that? And then how temporary is that? You go to the next environment where that same situation is about to happen. It's going to go the exact same way that it just did, because that's how these things work. There's so many times, Philip, and I know you'll appreciate this, where I'll ask someone like you or me, and I'll say, what are the odds that in that situation, there's a different outcome before the mistake happens?
Yeah.
And it's almost always like totally rare when we can prevent something from happening because we do have enough trust, or there is like the right combination of things. Like the unit is going to go in a common direction. That's one of the things that made me a great collector was, so forget about them. I know us.
Yeah.
And I know like our motions. And if you can stop doing this and you do this instead, you will at least be doing something different, because I know this doesn't work,
Yeah.
And that ability to know us really well allowed me to guide commanders, speak their language, and go, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you information no one else has. I'm going to go on the same patrols, and you're going to think, man, oh man, what are we doing here? Why are we making these mistakes? And then we're going to go forward from there. We're going to learn together. It is going to be filled with mistakes, because this stuff is impossible to do.
Oh, 100%. There was in another operational theater, at a commander that was negotiating with one of the warring factions. And I used to go in and just sit at the corner of the big formal meetings that happened on a regular basis and just watch what was going on. And I'd be able to identify who the key decision makers were. And the key decision makers weren't necessarily the ones that they were referring to as general or whatever at the front desk and all the rest of it, because you'd see little tells where they'd refer to someone else sitting in the background just to get a nod to say you can take this forward and all the rest of it. And after I'd used to produce sort of 4 or 5 pages of notes at the end of it and send that off to the general after he had his meeting and stuff. And he called me in one day and he said, right, Ingram, what's this bloody mumbo jumbo that you keep giving me? And I said, General, well, this is what it is. And it, I'd done it in another operational theater. It worked really well. He said, well, I think it's mumbo jumbo. Show me how it's adding value. And I said, okay, General, in the next meeting, when you're in, ask this man this question, and this is exactly what he'll do. And he looked at me and went, but give him his due. In the next meeting, he turned around and asked the very person the question that I set in exactly the right words. And that individual then reacted in exactly the way I had said he would react. And the general then turned around to me. He looked at me with wide eyes, nodded, and he couldn't get enough of the stuff. He really couldn't get enough of the stuff, because we then turned that round into, and I'd already started this, a human operation where after the meeting, whenever there was all the niceties going on, I had human teams that were going around and linguists going around who were bringing in the drinks and making sure the food was there and acting as getting people out to the drivers and having chit chats with people and all the rest of it and picking up little snippets. But each of them had, the RFIs that I was producing going through the meeting going, right, you've got all this out there. And it was such a manna from heaven intelligence gathering operation at that time, which then informed even more. And we got through the negotiations probably much quicker than we would have done if we hadn't been able to do that sort of stuff.
You're talking about things that are 100% like what I've also discussed. And I don't know if you learned that on your own, if you learned that in a book and everything, but I would sit with the new unit, whether I was new to them or they were new to me, and I'd watch their briefings. And I don't need their questions. I know what the questions are going to be. And again, I'm going to look at us first, right? And so I watch the potential operations being briefed. I watch the operations that had been done being briefed. And I'm just like, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, there's a problem, and so I would know now, I'm like, okay, I'm going to go out on that patrol. I'm going to go out on that patrol. Then I would make my relationships so I could, and then I'd bring, because I knew that I could bring back information the commander would be desperate to have. And it's like, what do you mean this farming thing didn't work? And as soon as the commander gave me access to him on his couch and I could talk to him, I would say, here are areas where I think we could improve, and we can improve, because these are things like, agricultural operations. We'll stick with that. If we slow down, if we stop forcing the Afghan government entity to come with us on our own idea, and I'll go set a meeting with the guy and I'll ask him and I'll find out what his plan is. Let's work within their plan. Boy, that makes the ag teams uncomfortable. But you know who loves it? The boss, because the boss is like, I'm tired of fucking up.
Yeah. Yeah,
and
it comes down to that relationship. It's the personal relationships with the people that enable you to go out and do the gathering, and it's the personal relationships with them being able to get the access into the boss to convince them. And you've almost got as much of a human intelligence operation with your friendly forces to carry out as you do when you're out gathering the information from enemy forces.
And I would say that this was not a common skill that you and I developed. And it took me a long time to learn how to be relevant to the commander, relevant to the staff, relevant to the enablers, and relevant to the sergeant major. And if you didn't have that soup with those 4 ingredients, you were in danger on your own camp, because they would kick you off or whatever it was, right? Yeah. It's very, very challenging stuff to do.
It is. And often you're dealing with a preconceived bias anyway when it's in there. And if you've got commanders, or you've got the commanders' gatekeepers who've got that preconceived bias, if the commander's got it, you've got no hope. You've got no hope whatsoever. The best thing you can do is sack yourself and walk away, because there's a real danger that you're just going to end up being getting the blame for everything that goes wrong, because the commander's not going to listen. And again, with the gatekeepers, if you can't get through the gatekeepers, you then become the easy person to blame, and the best thing you could do is sack yourself. And it's a difficult position to be in, especially when from the intel community, you tend to be of a much lower rank than those that you are trying to convince, and the rank bit is something that acts as a bit of a barrier, and this is where it's interesting. I remember in Iraq when I was there, I had built a good relationship up with the commander that we had, such that it got too good, because he wouldn't then let me go out to do my job, because he wanted me there the whole time to be a sounding board and briefings and all the rest of it. But then that forced me to get my people to go out and do the stuff that I wanted to do and should have been doing from the level. But it's getting that balance right. But he saw me as a crutch, and I recognized that he had this weakness that was being exploited by other members of his senior staff for their own ends. And if I broke away from that, they'd get in and poison the relationship. So really difficult times.
Boy, you said a lot of stuff in there. And I do want to get back to Israel, but I want to add these elements in. Either they need you close, or they push you out and they're like, can you go get this done in 3 days? And I'm like, 3 days? 3 days? No. I haven't even begun at 3 days. They're like, we're talking 6 weeks. Well, we don't have 6 weeks. And I'm like, well, then we got to make some decisions. I'll go out there and give you what I can, but you can't speed up trust building. You can't speed up the access that you need to get the information. And the other thing is when I have problems with the commander, I was pretty adept at going 1 or 2 levels above that commander and saying, hey, I'm not communicating with you with some things that are going on here, not putting anybody in harm's way or under the bus, but just saying, because everybody's got email, like, here's my report, here's what I'm seeing, more of this, let me know. And just kept sending it. And I would branch that out and send it to the other parts of the staff, 1 or 2 levels up. And all of a sudden I would hear my words coming down, and they'd be like, so such and such and such and such. And I'm like, that's mine. That belongs to me. And then you start to develop that top-down influence. But again, that we're moving fast. That takes a long time.
Yeah, no, 100%, 100%. So it's amazing, we are what, 8 hours apart, on the similarities in the things that have happened to us through our different careers. It's amazing. It's phenomenal.
Okay, so you were talking earlier about the operation going on where Israel is looking at Hezbollah to their north and sort of downplaying Hamas, thinking they've got a pretty good deal with those guys. Some of that in there could easily be an information operation, what people now call a PSYOP. PSYOP is a profession. Information operation is the operation. So in this information operation world, we're also seeing the Hamas people are exploiting the gullibility of people who don't understand war and fog and deaths and everything. All right, I'm shut up. Go ahead.
Hamas are pulling a blinder. The people are failing to recognize that every photograph we get out of Gaza is provided by someone who is either under Hamas's control or it's a Hamas photograph. Every bit of video that we get out has been rubber stamped by Hamas. Every statistic that we get out from a casualty perspective is a Hamas statistic. The statistics that are coming through the International Red Crescent, International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, that's coming out through UNRWA, through the United Nations. It's all coming from the same source, Hamas. And Hamas recognize that they cannot defeat Israel militarily. And they have also recognized, I think, that the Israelis got slightly frustrated, is an understatement. Pissed, I would say, is probably better, at the 7th of October attack, and are coming back in hard, which is why Hamas continues to use the Palestinian people in Gaza as human shields and use what would ordinarily be protected sites as military bases, which turns them in international law into legitimate military targets, because they know that they have to be unconventional in their approach. They're not a legal entity in any way, shape, or form. They are a recognized terror organization, so they're not going to be held to account. So they don't care what they do, but they know in the international community, Israel is a nation state with legal responsibilities, and they're exploiting the fact that there is political uncertainty, or political from a political perspective. Lots of nations around the world feel exceptionally uncomfortable at seeing these pictures and seeing the casualty figures and seeing what's coming out, and that is turning into political pressure on Israel. And Hamas recognizes that for the senior leadership on the ground to survive, what they need to do is exacerbate that political pressure as much as possible to move into ceasefires, and then exploit that to develop their positions, to do everything else to potentially get themselves out. And that's why we are subject to one of the most comprehensive, coherent, well thought out, well planned disinformation campaigns that's coming out of Gaza, and is focused on us because all of our mainstream press are picking up on it. I have seen international mainstream press outlets show videos of activity on the ground that are so clearly staged, it's unreal, and they put it out as gospel. I've seen international press describe incidents. We had the incident where there was a rocket exploded at a hospital last year, and it had been fired by one of the Palestinian groups at Israel, but had misfired, and the rocket had landed in the hospital. But the international press described it as an Israeli attack against a hospital. That is, and they'd done that within minutes of the first pictures coming out of the explosion, because Hamas had described it as an Israeli rocket attack on the hospital. Hezbollah had come in and backed that up, and we've got the Iranians pushing a lot of these pictures around and enabling a lot of the capability. But it's not just the Iranians, because if you look at what's going on from an international military pact perspective, the Russians are heavily involved in it. And I've got some interesting tracking information about lots of Russians that have been operating around the area. But you then have to ask yourself, who's the one winner out of what's going on in the Middle East at the minute? Well, it's Vladimir Putin with what's going on inside Ukraine, because he's not number one in the headlines anymore. And therefore, that's taking a lot of the pressure off what's going on, in particular in the United States, with the Speaker of the House blocking the vote going through to enable the aid package to be delivered to Ukraine because it's being linked to the US's southern border. Well, hey, come on, folks. They're two completely different issues. But your pressure is coming on from so many different areas, and it's all interlinked, and we have to recognize it's all interlinked.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. And look, I want to say this out loud so everybody understands. We're not in any way just diminishing atrocities or death or anything, but war is ugly. The war dragon.
And what you said is really, really important. The Israelis have not covered themselves in glory. They didn't cover themselves in glory beforehand, because the extreme right-wing elements of Israel, in particular in the West Bank, when they're seizing the lands and the territories, should be held to account. They shouldn't be backed up by the Israeli military and the Israeli police, and that's just wrong. The hardline element of Netanyahu's government, and Netanyahu's in a very difficult position. He's a hardliner himself, but he's got an extreme right-wing hardline element to his government that wants Israel to exert revenge first and foremost against the Palestinian people, and Hamas is a secondary issue, and they don't care how many people die in the process. Well, that's wrong. Israelis have got a very good, very mature targeting process that's in there. But Netanyahu, from a personal perspective, recognizes that if his coalition government fails, he's up for corruption charges and could end up in prison himself, and therefore there's a bit of personal protection that's coming in this. So you've got the perfect storm of bad politics in Israel, of manipulated politics going on around the rest of the Middle East as part of this historical Sunni Shia civil war, where Iran is influencing how things happen, and Hezbollah and Hamas are the executors of it at the moment, with Hamas being front and center, but the greatest victims are the Palestinian people. Oh, and by the way, the Palestinian people who none of the other Arab countries or Middle Eastern countries want to let come into their areas, even as refugees from a temporary perspective. The biggest fence that there is between Gaza and any country is not between Israel and Gaza, it's between Egypt and Gaza, and they're making it bigger.
Yeah. That says a lot, that last bit right there. And when we look at the complexity of this, you're 100% right. We have a thing here in America where our Congress for a long time now has sort of been locked up. We can't quite decide the direction we're going to go. And that's sort of how our thing works. The guy who today might become president, Donald Trump, he's like, hey, Republicans, I'm the boss of this party. That shit ain't going through here. And so they stop it, right? Because we do have an election and it is just down the road for us, right? And so all of these things go in. You are absolutely right that we should cast an eye on Putin, because when Putin is losing, and he's losing in the social world and the media world, he has a lot of levers to pull. And so if he pulls that Hezbollah and then Hamas lever and Iran lever, oh my goodness, he's got a lot of power.
Well, if you look at it from his perspective, where's he getting his ammunition from at the moment? The Russian defense industrial base is not keeping up with what the Russians are using in the front line. So he's relying on Iran for his ballistic missiles and his one-way attack drones. And he's almost certainly getting other ammunition from Iran and other technology. So he'll get technologies coming in through companies that are importing into Iran through shell companies. But he's also relying on North Korea. For goodness sake, Putin is relying on North Korea for ammunition for his artillery. That does not bode well for Russia's defense industrial base from any analytical perspective whatsoever. And therefore, he's manipulating everything we do to try and make sure that he doesn't have to expend as much as he's needed by restricting what's coming in from the West. The West was caught with his pants down because our defense industrial base hadn't had the capacity to get ammunition, in particular artillery ammunition, produced at the quantities that are now being proven to be needed in modern warfare, in a proper shooting war in Europe. And they're building up to do that. And that is a good thing for our defense in the long run. And I think what our voters aren't recognizing is, and this is what the Speaker of the House is doing, there's these billions of dollars that are being promised to Ukraine, and everyone's saying, hey, those are our taxpayers' dollars that should be spent at home. It shouldn't be sent to Ukraine and all the rest of it. Hey, folks, it is being spent at home. Those billions of dollars that are being allocated to Ukraine are being put to manufacturing companies inside the United States, inside the United Kingdom, inside Germany, inside the countries that have got a defense industrial base that manufacture ammunition. And that ammunition is being built using US steel, US explosives, US workforce, and that's enabling those companies to employ more people, to pay more taxes into the state and into the country, to then enable more secondary businesses. So you need more cafes, you need more car showrooms, you need more supermarkets, you need more housing for the extra staff that are coming in. It's all being spent locally, which is brilliant from an economical perspective. But and then the output that's being produced is being shipped off to Ukraine. But all the money is being spent at home. And this is where I think Donald Trump, when he comes in, he wants to keep this right up until he comes in and potentially wins the election. If he comes in, wins the election, he goes, we'll have the vote, we'll spend the dollars. Hey, look, all of these people around the local communities. I've increased your manufacturing capability. I've increased the number of jobs. I've done this, I've done that. And it's all because you've elected me.
Yeah. Boy, oh boy, you keep nailing it. I want to say a couple of things about this. One, the thing about where Russia is getting its arms, right? They can partner with Iran, and guess what? Iran is part of the unwashed. We don't let them do anything, and so it's a self-fulfilling. It's beneficial to both sides. And just for anybody who doesn't realize, where I'm at here in California, Orange, California, basically is where I'm at. If I was to drive the same distance as if I was leaving Tehran and I went to St. Louis, I'd be in Moscow. So Tehran to Moscow, Orange to St. Louis, same. So look, and you don't got to do it all on the road. You can put things on a railhead and nobody's going to ease. It's very hard to interdict that flow of arms, especially when Iran needs money and Russia needs arms, So it's a very clear thing that is obviously happening. And North Korea, same thing. Not that hard to do. Not that hard. Russia's a big place.
And so the other thing we have to realize in this is there are two groupings, and this is going to impact our global stability and our global political position for years to come. The two groupings are the countries that are dictated by presidential, parliamentary, prime ministerial election timelines, so 5 years effectively, and you've got the countries which think in multi-generational terms because they're led by dictators effectively. And the countries that are led by dictators, Russia with Vladimir Putin, China with Xi Jinping, North Korea with Kim Jong-un, the Grand Ayatollah in Iran, they can think in multi-generational terms, whereas we're having to think in our election timeframes, which we say 5 years, but in reality it's 3 years. But then you've got the midterms, so in reality it's 2.5 years. But the greater reality is, especially if Donald Trump gets in again, it's going to be, what is the president tweeting this evening, and what are the headlines going to be tomorrow? And therefore, we're reacting to everything. We're not becoming proactive. Whereas those that are working against us are being proactive. And I see this, and the analogy I use is it's like eating an elephant. What our governments are having to do is go, oh my God, it's an elephant, swallow it. And you're trying to swallow the elephant whole. Well, that doesn't quite work. Whereas you've got all of those that can think in multi-generational terms are going, we want to eat this elephant. So they'll take a little bite here and a little bite there and a little nibble here. And eventually they'll eat the whole elephant, and it's not going to choke them. We're choking in the elephants that we're eating every day.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. This new doc, this idea to get aid in, anytime I hear these things, my spy brain goes off and I'm like, yes. How are we going to use this to our advantage? Who can I meet? I want American boots on the ground because I want to be flipping people, right? Because that's what we do. And so that might be crazy, but it's dangerous. Of course it's dangerous. What we do is dangerous. That's not even a consideration. Yes, it's dangerous. By the way, that money that you're talking about that funds Ukraine also keeps in America, it keeps our boots off the ground. So
100%.
Those guys to send
the money, if we didn't spend it supporting Ukraine, it's a small fraction of the cost of us having to get engaged. If we had to get engaged, the gloves are off. You think the cost of living went bad whenever Russia first went into Ukraine? You ain't seen nothing yet, folks. If we get into a total war scenario, the impact that it's going to have on our society and the way we live and everything else today, it's off the scale to what's going on. So the Ukrainians are fighting our war for us. We should give them the wherewithal to do that.
Yeah. You think it's hard to live in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Look out if it truly breaks out, which is unlikely because it takes a lot of money and a lot of effort to do that. But we also shouldn't test that principle.
People say that. I've been involved, from joining the military first of all, in where you're influencing international geopolitics, whether it be at the lowest possible level up to where I got to quite senior, and I commentate on it a lot now. So it's been just over 40 years, and in that time, I have never seen a clear path to World War III, including during the Cold War and other bits and pieces. I can now see several clear paths that could lead to World War III, and that's scary.
Yeah, it is scary. Unlikely, Pete will say.
It is unlikely. Right. There's a lot to go through, but once you got those paths, things could jump through them, and we have to be really careful. And this is where, when we play domestic politics against an international threat, you're potentially undermining your whole domestic stability because you're not understanding the context. We have to get away from that.
So back to this, I'd agree, and I want to cover this port before we run out of ideas or in time. I understand people who are against it. I understand people who are for it, but I don't know, like, what do you think about it? Like, what's your position? And also, look, it's easy to say, it won't work, or it'll work, and then have it be, and you'd be right until the second that you're not, and you're like, oh, that was stupid. Whichever direction you go.
The port idea, I can't see the logic behind it, because it's come with the same cry that there's not going to be any US boots on the ground. Well, I'm sorry, for it to be a temporary port, it has to connect with the ground somewhere. So who's going to do that connection if it's not the troops that are building it? And anything that you're constructing, you measure the time frame in weeks, not hours. Even if you're building it as a floating thing and you're bringing it in and all the rest of it. And then once you've got the ability to dock ships in and unload them, so you're going to need cranes, infrastructure, and all the rest of it, how are you going to distribute it? Mm-hmm. Who's going to be responsible for the trucks coming in the other side and doing everything else and thinking it through? Surely it would be much easier to get pressure onto Israel to open in different areas different border crossings. And I was only talking on because I helped co-host a television program, but I was in the UK. I was talking yesterday to an advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I was saying that off camera, the trick that I think the Israeli government is missing is not putting big civil military centers inside the areas that the Israelis have already cleared. And you then build a big civil military center where within that you've got medical facilities, you've got aid facilities, you've got everything else to try and attract the people out of where they're concentrated at the moment, but where where Hamas are still trying to use them as shields back up to places. And you can put the aid in there, you can put medical help in there, and you turn that into a powerful information campaign to say, hey, we're helping you, we're bringing you back. And in the background of that, you've got reconstruction of housing and everything else for people from a more permanent perspective, because you control the ground, you're in there. Do that from the outset. That's positive. That's where Israel's missing out.
Yeah. And can they do that, or do they need external help to do that?
Well, even if they need external help to do that, turn around and say to the international community, come and help us. And the international community can then, the United States can come in, UK can come in, and we can turn around to all of these groups that are protesting and saying, support Palestine. We're saying, we are supporting the Palestinian people. We're coming in to enable this. So, instead of these initiatives of, how the hell are we going to build this port and get that in and connect it to the beach somewhere which has got no infrastructure connecting at the moment, and we're going to have no troops on the ground, we don't know how to distribute stuff. I think that was a sort of bit of a political sop statement that was being made to try and have a domestic impact rather than a proper international effect. I can't see it happening anytime soon. I hope to be proved wrong. I hope.
Sure. Right. Yeah. But we also know that at least the U.S., when we go somewhere with an aid package, it tends to not go well. It tends to go to the wrong people. It gets exploited. Whatever. Right. And so, and look again. We need people like Philip and Pete on the ground. And so, set up something in the rear where you can allow people to come through, have a rough screening process, whatever you need to do, provide aid, get our hands on people so that we can start to debrief and really get better and really more efficient and less obviously lethal. And I do want to say this, Israel is, if you look at, I don't know if you know John Spencer's work, but he has done a lot of work on urban, and he's so fantastic. And he talks very critically to people who are critical of Israel. It's like, hey, these guys are doing state-of-the-art stuff to avoid civilian casualties. However, state-of-the-art inclusion of civilians into the military structure on the Hamas side. And so you want something to not be dangerous, but it's built to be dangerous. And that is tough on any commander. And
it's really tough on any commander. And this is where when attacking a target, there's two elements. There's the necessity and the proportionality. The necessity, is it a legitimate military target? Yes, no. Yes, right, bang. The proportionality, that's where the appetite for collateral damage comes in, and that's more a political decision than a military decision, even though military commanders have to make it. And I know in the UK our proportionality tends to zero collateral damage. I know the US tends to as close to zero as we can get, but it's we recognize that there's going to be an inevitable level of collateral damage. I suspect in the environment where Israel is, and with the extreme right-wing elements in Netanyahu's government, that the appetite for collateral damage is politically a lot easier for them to accept than it would be for us to accept, which is why we're seeing the collateral damage levels that we got at the moment. It doesn't mean the targeting process is flawed. It doesn't mean that they're committing war crimes, because they're not. They're targeting legitimate military targets, but it just means that there's this political appetite to accept more collateral damage. And whenever you've got civilians being used as shields, there's an inevitable level of collateral damage that is sickening to the pit of my stomach when that's going on. The only way to reduce it is to get your military operation finished as quickly as possible.
Right. Which is not gentle. Let's just understand that. Like when the military moves fast to get the initiative done, it is probably the least lethal way. However, it is horribly lethal, and that's just how that goes. Yeah. Oof. It's crazy.
I'd liken it to the decisions to use nuclear weapons during the Second World War. The calculation that went on is we are going to be super lethal to a lot of innocent people on a very short period of time. But actually, if we don't do that and we have to invade on the ground, it's going to cost hugely more lives, not just from our service personnel, but also the civilians that are on the ground, and have a greater impact on civilian infrastructure. So, hard, fast, lethal straight away can reduce the overall casualty numbers if something goes on for an extended period of time.
Yeah. And then I guess the other thing we could say about all this is, people are working on getting a ceasefire. So far, both sides are saying, no, thanks. And so until will is imposed on one side or the other, and I always said, like, the fastest way to turn all this off is to have Hamas surrender and give up all the hostages, and then things calm down.
They can stop.
They aren't willing to do that.
If they did that, they'd stop it tomorrow. But the difficulty is, Hamas are still part of a group of organizations that want the state of Israel destroyed, all Jews killed, and there to be a wider caliphate where the Iran and Tehran in particular is at the center of the caliphate. Those are the stated aims. Hamas has moved slightly away from that, but Hezbollah that are controlling them still got that as a stated aim, as of all of the other different Iranian-backed groups that are operating in the areas. And that's why we're seeing the Houthis doing what they're doing and everything else, because it's still part of their stated aims. Yeah,
and let's understand that these Shia groups are fighting a proxy war with Sunni warriors. So as soon as you think you got your hands wrapped around this thing, man, it gets
it's back to what I said at the beginning. It's a Sunni Shia civil war that's been going on for centuries. So it's just been played out with different names and different little boxes that we love to fill in and put on maps and stuff to try and explain it in modern parlance.
If you could say one thing to the Hamas commander as his intelligence guy, what would you want to say to him?
I'd say surrender now, or find a way out quickly, because you're killing your own people and you're going to get killed. But I suspect, unfortunately, like many terrorists, especially Middle East terrorists, he sees that as martyrdom.
Yeah, they'll die with a smile on his face and smell like roses. This is an actual thing, people. This is an actual thing that they believe. And then what would you want to tell boss man Netanyahu? What would you want to tell him?
I'd say you're getting your information campaign wrong. You need to get control of the information sphere again, because you may be winning tactically on the ground, but you're losing strategically. And we've seen that in Vietnam and elsewhere.
Yeah. One of the things that I probably would sit down and say is like, look, you have to win this fight militarily. You guys got that covered. You'll get that done. But socially, culturally, politically, the religious side, the business side, the economic side, like you have to have these other fights.
Yeah,
and they are losing a number of these fights.
Yeah, and you have to have in place a longer term solution that will allow both sides to move towards, and the international community to agree with. And unfortunately, for Netanyahu's perspective, no, he's written this off, but the only way that you're going to do that is a properly recognized two-state solution, I think.
That's not possible when he's in charge, so we got to get him out of there to have that happen. And it takes two entities to make a two-state solution. And so far, the bigger problem has been the Palestinian side.
Who've refused a two-state solution in the past, and all the different groupings, and the current groupings do not have that as part of the doctrine. So, a long-term solution from a Western theoretical perspective sounds brilliant, and we'll just do this. But the practicalities, there's huge steps to get there before we can even get close.
Is this? I don't. It's not a very good similarity, but there is something to this. Are we looking at the end of at least the Gaza Strip? Maybe the West Bank stays there, but are we looking at Palestinians, Gazans walking the earth like Rhodesians, where they're like, we don't have a country, we all move to whatever place?
Possibly, but I'm not sure. The Palestinian people have got the place. They can move towards the West Bank, but I think they'll want to stay where they are and have that rebuilt. The Hamas are not represented as the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people that are in there, from a historical perspective, are nomads anyway. Most of them pushed out of other Arab countries. And again, I'll bring Hamas into this. Hamas's background is in the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood were big in Egypt, and Egypt have pushed the Muslim Brotherhood out completely, which is part of the reason why they're building a bigger fence. They don't want elements of the Muslim Brotherhood or anything that could regenerate it back into Israel again. And other Arab nations see that too. And therefore, I don't know whether I'm right in this, but whenever I look at it, I almost see the Palestinian people has been considered in the same way that in Europe you consider the Romani gypsies. They are this, these underlings. We don't want them to have a state. We don't want them to have an identity. We see them as marauding criminal threats that are there. And I may be wrong in my analysis, but it's an analogy that allows me to put it into context with what's going on.
Yeah, well, and it's not an unreasonable guess. I would have a similar thing where, and sometimes you're just not even seeing, like, there is no Chaldean state, there is no Assyrian state, these things. There's no Yazidi state. There's a lot of bodies of people that at one point had a nation of some kind or another, maybe a prominent one in some cases, like the Assyrians, but there's no movement to give the Kurds a state. I mean, they have a state sort of, but not really, and so that might be what happens to folks from Gaza, unless they want to be part of an Israeli state. That would be, like that could be an enclave or something, but they would have to be within the Israeli state, I think, to make that happen. I can't imagine right now where Gaza gets to be an independent, somewhat recognized international entity, especially with the fuckery that's gone on with the UN.
Yeah, I can't see where that would come in. But we also have to recognize that in the UN, the Palestinian representative, who is Fatah by background, Fatah had a civil war that lasted 10 days with Hamas in Gaza, over Gaza, before they were pushed out. So you've got this in-house fighting between the two different groupings that are saying they're representing or leading the Palestinian people. The one common denominator is, if you look at all of it, the country that's behind stirring the pot and keeping the dissent going is Iran.
That's good for Iran. That's good for
Very
Iran.
good for Iran.
Keep all that mess somewhere else, push a political narrative somewhere else,
and with Iran stirring the pot, it's keeping the pressure off. Oh, Vladimir Putin, we're back there again.
Hey, look at that. There we go again. All right, well, listen, that's an hour, man. That was a solid hour. I love that. Anything you want to say before you wrap up? Anything you want to ask me?
No, I just want to say thank you very much indeed for having me. It's a real pleasure. And it's always a real pleasure to talk to people across the pond. Yeah.
And everybody check out your work.
Check out my work. Come into haremedia.com. I'm on regularly on UK Talk TV, which can be found online. I've done quite a bit in Sky Arabia, and other bits and pieces. You'll find me in lots of the UK and international newspapers. Not as much across the pond in your part of the world. I used to do a bit there, but hey, it moves around. This counts even better than any of the mainline channels.
I love it. All right, man. Stand by. I'll be right back to you to say goodbye. Everybody else, I'll see you next time.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.